Okay, now a lot of us may be wondering, what is the real Donald Trump like? Well, here is his niece, Mary Trump, who's going to help us understand.
But first, I want to make sure you really want to know, because I'm not sure you do, but if you do, more than happy to tell you, although happy may be the wrong word in this context. If Donald were a patient of a clinical psychologist, and if he were willing to go through a battery of tests in order to be diagnosed, chances are, I'm speculating, but it's informed speculation, that he would come back with a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. There's probably a lot of comorbidity there. He's a very troubled man.
To people who don't know who Mary Trump is, just explain to us the Trump family and where you fit into it.
Well, I am the daughter, the youngest child of the oldest Trump sibling. So my dad is Donald's older brother, the oldest son of Fred Trump, who was a New York real estate guy, extraordinarily successful one. He also happened to be a sociopath, which, as you can imagine, had a fairly negative impact upon all five of his children. And my dad, as the oldest, had all of the expectations placed on him. My grandfather was a sort of authoritarian, patriarchal figure who cared about nothing more than his real estate empire. And my father, as the oldest son, as the namesake, was expected from birth to take over, to be groomed for that role. And for various reasons, some of which I understand and some of which remain a mystery, my grandfather, by the time my dad was in college probably, found him wanting, found that this was not the person he wanted to succeed him. And despite my father's trying, he worked for my grandfather in the summers. He was a business major at Lehigh University. He went to work for my grandfather's company immediately upon graduation. It just didn't work out. My grandfather never gave him a real shot, never gave him any real responsibility. And my dad was miserable. So after, I think, a year or 2 years, he made the very difficult and, in my view, brave decision to say, I'm not doing this anymore. And because he, when he was in college, had gotten his private and professional pilot's licenses, he decided that he wanted to become a pilot. And he applied to TWA. He was accepted on his first shot. He was taken into the 1964 class. And he quit Trump management. And that created a rift between them that was never healed, even though my grandfather insisted my dad come back. And he only lasted 8 months as a pilot. But he was a pilot for TWA for 8 months in 1964, which at the time was a huge deal. Pilots were rock stars. This is the dawn of the jet age, but he was getting so much pressure from his father, from his younger brother, Donald, to come back to the family business because nothing else you could do could possibly measure up to that. And being a pilot was like being a bus driver in the sky. They considered it a demeaning profession. And my dad couldn't take the pressure. And it was at that point he started drinking, and his alcoholism from then on never came under control. He did go back to work for my grandfather, but by then Donald had come into the company and had completely leapfrogged my dad. And even though he was 8 years younger, my grandfather passed my dad over to make Donald the president of Trump management at the age of 24 after my dad had been there for 11 years. And that was it. Essentially, by the time my dad was 30, my parents were divorced. He had two very young children, and he basically was given a sinecure at Trump management. And to all intents and purposes, his life was effectively over. So his place in the family directly impacted my place in the family. And also, I was a girl. They were very misogynistic. Even the women in my family were misogynists. And because of that, nobody cared Nobody cared what Freddie's children were doing anyway, but they certainly didn't care what a girl was going to be doing.
Freddie, your father.
Freddie, sorry, yes, Freddie, my father.
Fred, as you say, also your grandfather's name was given. He was Freddie Jr.
Yeah, my grandfather was always Fred, and my dad was always Freddie. So it just went downhill from there, and he started having serious health issues in his 30s, and then at 39 he had open heart surgery, which went okay, but then he was unable to stop drinking. He chain smoked, and then he died at the age of 42.
And how old were you then?
I was 16. And because, he and I had a tricky relationship as well. We weren't close because he was so sick and my family ostracized him. They treated him very badly, and I picked up on that as well. And after he died, they did nothing to fill the void. So he died in September of 81, and then we had Thanksgiving and we had Christmas, but nobody in my family spoke to me in between that. So there was nobody was taking care of us in any way, shape, or form, and we were just sort of left to deal with it on our own.
And so through the generations, the effects were clear of the way your grandfather behaved. Now, you describe your grandfather as a sociopath. You're a psychologist. Could you just, it's a word that is thrown around, like narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
But as a psychologist, could you just explain to us what you mean by a sociopath?
I think there are two ways to look at this. We can use these words colloquially. We all know what we mean when we say somebody's a sociopath, and I'll explain that. But when we say somebody's a narcissist, we get that they're full of themselves, essentially, is what we're talking about. But then there's the actual diagnostic definitions of those terms. And sociopathy is actually not a diagnostic category, but it's on a continuum with the personality disorder. So if you look at, there's narcissistic personality disorder, there's antisocial personality disorder, etc. If Donald were a patient of a clinical psychologist, and if he were willing to go through a battery of tests in order to be diagnosed, chances are, I'm speculating, but it's informed speculation, that he would come back with a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. There's probably a lot of comorbidity there. He's a very troubled man. But diagnosis is a process. You can't just look at somebody and say, oh, they're this, that, or the other. It's just like a medical diagnosis. You have to do tests, etc. So I also think it brings us only so far. But if we want to understand sociopathy or psychopathy, we look at it as being on the extreme end of the continuum of antisocial personality disorder, which is basically, in its most basic sense, people who are very comfortable breaking the rules, breaking at the lower end of the continuum, people who play hooky, people who lie a lot, people who shoplift, maybe don't think that the rules apply to them. They know the difference between right and wrong. They just don't care. And then as you go down the other end of the continuum, things get more serious, things get darker, and you end up at the extreme end, which would be psychopathy or sociopathy.
You said in an earlier book that you wrote that Donald Trump continues to exist in the dark space between the fear of indifference and the fear of failure. How important is it, Mary, do you think, that people understand that there is a side to this of trying to understand Donald Trump that is much more than simply understanding his politics? You have to understand who he is. And that really has been, in a way, sort of your campaign and your energy. You have video channels that you run. You've written, many books connected to the subject and directly on the subject. You're a political campaigner against Donald Trump. You said in your book 2020, Too Much But Never Enough, I can't let him destroy my country. why has it become part of that as being actually trying to explain the mental position of Donald Trump?
Yeah, understanding his politics, such as they are, gets us only so far. First of all, I don't believe he has any. This is a man without ideology. He is an instinctual creature who does what he does to get what he needs or wants. It's really that simple. Understanding what drives him, understanding his psychological makeup matters, because that's how we figure out how to deal with him. And I've been trying to make the case for a long time now that if we do understand his insecurities, his psychopathologies, his unconscious processes, then we know how to confront him. And if you, it's fairly complicated, but in terms of the things you mentioned, his insecurity and his fear of failure, if we understand that those are the things that drive him, then those are the points of weakness. That's where we put pressure to bear. If we understand that one of the things he's most afraid of is being found out, to have people understand that everything about him that's projected publicly is based on a myth, that he's literally nothing of who he claims to be. He's nothing other people have purported him to be, starting with my grandfather, who's the man responsible for having created this myth. Then we understand that that's where we attack him. If we understand that he has to, like, in order to protect his psyche, in order to protect his extraordinarily fragile ego, has to project this idea that he's the greatest, the best. He's always speaking in hyperboles. He's trying to convince himself as much as he's trying to convince you, me, or everybody else, right? Then we understand that he doesn't really believe it either. So we attack those points as well. I continue to think that the best weapon against Donald Trump is mockery and just revealing all of those weaknesses, because otherwise he's going to continue to get away, as he has now for decades, with everything he's done with impunity. And shockingly, he's much more powerful and protected now than he ever was. So where is there even access? It almost feels like we've lost our opportunity, because he's back in the Oval Office and he is literally got a phalanx of sycophants and enablers around him, making sure that the reality about him, his bad poll numbers, for example, or the fact that people think that he's an idiot when it comes to the economy, or just a failure along all of these different dimensions, they're protecting him from that knowledge, just as he so desperately tries to protect himself.
Why has this become so important to you?
Because I know him, and I know.
What's he like?
He's exactly what you would think. He's.
As a kid, was he like that with you, and when you ever met, or you know?
He's the only person I know who's incapable of evolving. He's never changed. He's also the same in every situation, which is also an alarming thing to say about an adult human being. You know, you should be different with people you're intimate with or crowds you're talking in front of. He's not. He's the same guy. The only way Donald has changed, because he was always a bully, you know, even when we were in the backyard playing baseball, like I was 6 and he was 28 or however, I don't remember how much older he is than I am, but, you know, in his late 20s and I'm a little 6-year-old kid, he would still throw the ball as hard as he could at me. You know, he did it once. I thought I'd broken every single bone in my hand, you know, because he has to win, he has to be better than, etc. So he's always been that guy. Can I swear?
You can swear, yes. We might take it out, but go swearing.
Okay, sorry.
We're very polite on the Daily Tea, but please do.
I mean, we say, like, he's always been an asshole, right? But, you know, he was our uncle. So what are you going to do? And nobody's terrible all the time, right? And I mean, I know my brother had moments with him because, again, they were guys, so they were allowed to go to the driving range together or whatever. And there were times when he actually, did me a favor or whatever. And when I was in my early 20s, he hired me to write his second book. So we did spend a bit of time together. And he is charming. He has his charms. I mean, you probably wouldn't find him charming. Most people don't, but there's a particular kind of person who kind of gets sucked in by it. And there was also a time when there was this very small spark of kindness. Like he had an impulse to be kind, but that became eradicated because it didn't serve my grandfather's purposes by any stretch of the imagination, and it didn't serve Donald's. And that's one hallmark of a sociopath, is they are really good at finding other people to use towards their own ends. And that's kind of the way Donald devolved, I should say. So we're now at the point, I said he's never changed. True in characterologically, but in terms of any good impulses he ever has had, those are gone. And he has no redeeming characteristics anymore. And I think he's dangerous.
And just to say again, why is this important to you now? Politically, I suppose, is the thing, because you've been described as somebody who could become part of the foundations if there is ever to be a fight back by the Democrats in America. Then you, Mary, could be one of those key voices that enables that.
I didn't realize I'd been described that way. That's news. Fascinating. If that's the case, it's because I'm very clear-eyed about this. There are no pulling punches here. We're way past the point of being polite or playing by the old rules. The old rules don't exist because the Republican Party essentially doused them in gasoline and set them on fire. The Democrats haven't caught up with that yet. And we cannot continue to extend the benefit of the doubt to somebody who has proven time and time again he's unworthy of it. So this continues to matter to me because he continues to have power. I don't see how that isn't recognized. We can laugh at him, sure, and mock him and say that he doesn't know what he's doing or that he's in some kind of cognitive decline. I'm not disputing any of those claims. I make them myself. But the point of the matter is he still is the president of the United States of America, which fills me with horror to say. And even if he doesn't know why he's doing what he's doing, even though if he's doing things like imposing tariffs because he doesn't understand how they work, all of this has a very real impact on our future as Americans, who we are as a people, who we are as a country, but it also has a massive deleterious impact on not just our standing in the world, but on the world. Because he's beholden to Vladimir Putin, or because he doesn't understand the importance of diplomacy and statecraft, or the geopolitical moment, is endangering the Western alliance. So this is serious stuff, and there is nobody in his party, certainly, who's going to do anything about it, because in my view, they have all bought in to whatever his agenda is, to weaken American institutions, to weaken American democracy, to put in place some kind of authoritarian structure in which they continue to have power. And they're not willing to challenge him either because they're afraid or because they only care about their power. And that's where we are right now. And I do not see this as the moment to step back and say, well, we're just going to have to let this play out however it does. We don't have that luxury.
Let's talk about his popularity, because you can make, lots of criticisms of him, and many people, often in the establishment, make the criticisms of him. Those criticisms are also made here. But the facts are, in 2016, he did beat Hillary Clinton. In 2020, he received the second highest votes that a presidential candidate had ever gained, only beaten by Joe Biden, who received the highest ever number of votes in the popular vote that a presidential candidate had ever gained. So he did incredibly well in 2020. Joe Biden did better. He wins again in 2024 to become only the second president to have a non-contiguous presidential term in office. He speaks, doesn't he? He is a disruptor. And he speaks to something around, I think, two big issues. One is this idea of security, and the other is the left behind. And he speaks of loving his voters and his supporters. What do you put his popularity down to? Are all those people who vote for him time and time again and maintain their support for him, are they deluded? Do they not understand the types of arguments you make?
Well, one thing that needs to be said is America is a deeply broken country, and it has been for a long time. Donald is not an anomaly. He is, I think, the logical conclusion to the last 40 years of Republican degradation. But to your point, I think there are different categories of people, and there are different reasons why they make the decisions they make. Just as in any other culture, 25% of any population is basically just the worst people. We have our white supremacists and our Christian nationalists and the people who are just, they love the cruelty. That is a selling point for them. They love being represented by the guy who only represents their interest. Now, typically, I think one of the goals of liberal democracy is to contain those people. But when he came into office in 2017 and the Republicans were in charge of everything, those people were represented by basically 100% of the federal government. So that disease of Christian nationalism and white supremacy sort of metastasized. Then we have low information voters who have always been Republicans and they're always going to vote Republican. You're more likely to get divorced than you were to switch political parties. And they're not paying that much attention. So, of course, the Republicans, because this is a myth that has been perpetrated by mainstream corporate media for way too long now. Republicans are better on the economy. Republicans are better on national security, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, none of that is true. But that has always been the way it's been framed. Democrats are only good on social issues. And then we have the very serious problem, and I'm sure this is true here, maybe not to the same extent, but very possibly, the ways in which our media are siloed now. So there are people who support Donald Trump who do not know that he was convicted on 34 felony counts.
They may not care. Maybe they know
and
they don't care.
Well, a lot of them don't care. That's true. But there are many who just don't know. And how do you break through? And that's a huge problem that we confront now as well. Especially, again, if you're a low information voter or you're just getting the wrong information and you are sort of susceptible to his charms, because again, I know it sounds completely unlikely to people who can't stand him and think he's an idiot and think he's crass and all of these other things, and a criminal, because he's that too. It's very difficult to understand that he does have that certain charisma. And that's why the Republicans have hung on to him, because there's literally nobody else in the Republican Party that could draw the kind of support he continues to draw. And I think it is a devastating commentary on America that he has continued to get more votes, especially considering what happened in 2020 and because of his egregious and I believe mishandling of COVID. In excess of 400,000 Americans died who would not have otherwise. I do not understand how he escaped that, plus the devastation to the economy. All of that has been wiped away.
Is Trump a unique phenomenon that when he isn't the president, this all changes? Or is he the start of a type of leader in America who is going to use the same playbook as he uses? You went to, I know one of the slightly warmer moments within the Trump family was Ivanka and Jared Kushner's wedding. I think you actually went there. There's been some discussion of, could his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, could he be the next president of the United States? Could Donald Trump Jr. be the next president of the United States? Or do you think that he is a singular phenomenon and things will go back to the more normal process of traditional Republicans versus the Democrats?
Well, just as a quick aside, one of the things I most resent about Donald's continuing to be where he is that we have to mention people like Jared Kushner and Donnie as possible contenders. That's just really depressing. But I can't think of an individual right now who could replace Donald in that way. However, if the question is, will so-called Trumpism survive Donald? I think the answer is very different now from what it would have been 4 to 6 years ago. The answer now is yes. And the reason for that is because, again, he is the logical conclusion to where the Republican Party has been tending. He's shown the Republican Party a new roadmap. This is how you push the envelope. This is how you get away with things. This is how you normalize more extreme positions. This is how you soften the ground to get people to accept anything you're willing to do to them, including dismantling the social safety net, for example. So why is that the case now? Well, because they've been preparing for this for a very long time. And in those 4 years he was out of the Oval Office, he was not out of power. He was still the de facto leader of the Republican Party. And even though he's not a leader and he doesn't know, he's not in charge of crafting any legislation or coming up with any grand strategy, there are a lot of other people who were doing that work for him, but for the benefit of the party. So we see it's been 130 days or so into this new regime. We see just how much destruction they've already wrought, how seriously they've weakened many of our institutions, dismantled others. And I think that's all part of their grand strategy, so that when Donald no longer is on the scene, there won't be any mechanism by which the Democrats can get back into power anyway. Or things will be so bad that people will continue to look to the Republicans because they do kind of control the media infrastructure, and they're really good, one, at disinformation, and two, at changing the system so that it benefits them. You said earlier that Donald won or Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 only in America. Every other country she would have been president because she won the popular vote by 3 million. We have a very, very bad system.
You do have a very odd process, that's true. But that's the system.
Yeah, that is the system.
Democrats won under it as well as Republicans.
True.
So.
Well, actually, I don't know if that's true or not. But either way, it's wrong. It's just, if the person who wins the most votes doesn't win, there's a problem. But Republicans are much better at exploiting our structural weaknesses, for sure. And that's what they've been doing, and that's what they continue to do. And that's why I'm worried.
Do you fear he might run again?
I don't. He said recently that he didn't plan to, but there's no reason to believe anything he says. However, it's not about whether or not he'll run. It's about whether or not he'll leave.
Because obviously the Constitution says you can't run for a third presidency.
Right. Well, they're going to look for a loophole. They'll say, well, they just meant 3 consecutive terms or what have you. They'll come up with some argument and the Republican Party will go along with it. But it's tricky because he ran in 2024 because he needed to stay out of prison. So he doesn't have that to worry about anymore. But it's very difficult for me to imagine Donald ceding power. So I don't know. I think with him, though, again, it's more likely that he'll just say, I'm president for life and I'm not going anywhere. And he'll challenge people to get rid of him. Like he's doing that with the judiciary now. They're saying, you must do this. And he's saying no. And they're saying, you have to. And his response is, go ahead and make me. You and what army, like what enforcement mechanism is there? How do you get rid of him? We don't know because we've never had this problem. But I think he's willing to challenge that.
Let's talk about the Democrats, because whilst you still have a democracy, Mary, the Democrats will need to win. Politics, in the end, as I'm always reminded by politicians, is a popularity contest to a degree. As you say, in America, there's a slightly odd way that you do get to a result in your presidential races. But a lot of the criticism that you hear about the Democrats is that they failed to know how to harness those people who felt left behind, who worried about security of the nation, and actually seemed to be more obsessed. And this doesn't mean these issues aren't important. Diversity, cultural discussions about the kind of country America is, or the kind of country lots of different nations are. They seem to be involved in the wrong battles and couldn't speak to that base, which was often sometimes unusual for Democrats to even understand. Young black men who vote for Trump, Latino voters who vote for Trump. What was it in the Democrats' DNA between 2020 and 2024 that meant that by the time they got to the election, they were in a position where they could even possibly lose it to a man, if you are to be believed, that it could be a dictator?
Well, if I'm to be believed,
or you argue, sorry, or that you argue, I don't want to take a position on this, I've got to be super careful, that you argue has some desires to possibly be a dictator.
Yeah, and that's completely fair because, I'm not an authority on such things, but also Donald has said that. That's what he wants. So every once in a while, we should maybe take him at his word, although most of the time he's lying, so who knows. But it's a really good point, and there's so many factors that have gone into this because we have to remember what we do. We have to remember this, but everybody's forgotten it. The hideous cards Joe Biden was dealt. He came in, COVID was at its height, the economy was in free fall, democracy was on a knife's edge. We just had an attempted insurrection. Donald was perpetuating the big lie that Joe Biden hadn't actually won the election legitimately. In January of 2021, 5,000 Americans were dying every day from COVID. And that's when Joe Biden came into office. So, as you know, the impact of COVID reverberated well past the time we had a vaccine. The supply chain issues took a long time to resolve. And the Biden-Harris administration did an extraordinary job under awful circumstances. They didn't get credit for it. Part of that was Democratic messaging. Part of that was the failures of the corporate media to report accurately on what was going on. Part of it, too, was the fact that so many people were still sort of shell-shocked and reeling from what had happened. I mean, not just America, of course, but in the context of America, we were suffering mass casualty events every day, and none of that was ever addressed. The people in the country were traumatized in a way they never had been. Donald, instead of uniting us against COVID, he divided us against each other. It became people who wear masks, people who don't, people who get vaccines, people who don't, people who believe that COVID is a serious threat, people who don't. He divided us against each other, further weakening us. None of that was ever addressed. So there's only so much Joe Biden can do. And I think that the other blow that people didn't expect but perhaps should have is the ways in which the Republican Party rallied around Donald after he almost tried to get all of them killed in the insurrection as well. I mean, that was one of the most unexpected and consequential events of 2021. Not the insurrection itself, but the fact that mere weeks later, every single Republican got on board with Donald Trump. That should have been the end of it right then and there. He was impeached. He's 3 votes away from being convicted in the Senate. That's when we should have been done with it. But for reasons hopefully we'll find out someday, the Republican Party turned back to him to be their leader. And I think the Democrats have found themselves on their back foot. The Democrats continue not just fail to meet the moment, they fail to understand the moment. And one of my biggest criticisms of the Biden administration is that they didn't see a second Trump term coming, and they failed to prepare adequately. They should have dealt with the Ukraine situation much more differently. They should have dealt with the situation in Gaza much more differently. They should have put in more safeguards. But I think part of it's complacency. Part of it was just a failure of understanding where people in this country were. Part of it was honestly just failing to recognize what was happening globally. Incumbents in every single country, regardless of political affiliation, were losing by massive margins. And if that's the case, there's no reason to think we're going to be immune, especially when in America, really the thing that matters most to American voters is the economy. And if it is not explained to them properly, if they don't understand that inflation, yes, it's higher than it should be, but 1, that's because of the last 4 years. And 2, this is according to The Economist, America had the best economy in the world, comparatively speaking. It was the envy of the world, according to the not exactly liberal Economist. And yes, prices were higher, but there were reasons for that too. But if you don't understand the reasons and you're only going to blame the guy who's in power, then I guess you're willing to accept all sorts of other things too, like the fact that Donald and the Republicans were very explicit about what they had in store for a second administration.
So dealt a bad hand. I understand that. You said there were some ways of communicating that were problematic. Surely one of the biggest factors that undermined the Democrats' campaign was that until almost the very last moment, just over 100 days to go, the Democrats were presenting to the nation as the next president of the United States, Joe Biden, a man who was mentally and physically incapable, and it was known, as the new book has revealed, incapable of taking on that incredibly onerous and important task. Wasn't the Democrats' failure to be straight with the American voter that Joe Biden should never have been the candidate for that election? The Democratic Party themselves, parts of the media, were guilty of deliberately misleading the voters, and the voters could smell a rat when Kamala Harris suddenly became the candidate and Joe Biden decided that he wasn't going to stand.
Yeah, there's so much about that. I don't know. I had the great misfortune of being in Atlanta for the debate. I was a surrogate for President Biden. Great timing. It was awful. It was just completely awful. And yes, you're right. There was no recovering from that at all.
How do you mean you were a surrogate for Joe Biden?
I was one of the people there to give the interviews and do the spin room afterwards, which, as you can imagine, was a bit of a challenge.
Tell us what that was like.
Do I have to?
Because please, because it was a fascinating watch from over here. Tell us what it was like watching that as somebody who knew you had to go out and say, "Our guy did great."
Oh, we didn't know. I know.
You were supposed to be saying.
We were supposed to be. No, that was not something I was going to be capable of doing. It was absolutely awful. From the second Joe Biden opened his mouth, we knew that it was a disaster, and there was not going to be any way to spin it. But here's the other thing, and this also gets to your question, and I'm not defending Joe Biden's decision. I mean, I did at the time because what am I going to do, right? It's Joe Biden or
You were one of the
Donald.
people who might be criticized for saying you should have said at the time there's a problem. You at the time were quite dismissive of health concerns about before Atlanta of health concerns.
Well, because nothing I said was going to make a difference, right? So we had a choice here. Undermine our candidate and risk his losing because we're undermining him, or saying, no, look who he's running against. There was a point in which it didn't matter. If Joe Biden's the candidate, and Donald is dangerous. Because what I said in the lead up to the 2020 election was even more true now. When I was asked, what are the consequences of Donald getting a second term? My answer is, it will be the end of the American experiment. That would not have been the case if we got a second Biden term, even if Kamala Harris had to take over midway through. So I just didn't think it was worth starting, getting into that. Also because I have no access to what's going on behind the scenes at all. I'm not connected to anybody in the White House or in the Biden team. So I completely agree conceptually with the notion that he should have been, as he had promised, a transitional president, and Kamala Harris should have been starting to run in 2021. No doubt about it. But since that wasn't what was happening, I've never met the man. I have no way of knowing what's really going on. I felt like, we had to work with what we had. So one of the also horrifying things about that debate, though, Donald Trump was awful as well, just in a different way. He was saying he was crazy. He was belligerent. He lied profusely during that debate. He said things that were incendiary. And because he said them with energy, it didn't matter because Joe Biden was mumbling and not making any sense.
Why did Kamala Harris lose? You said that her campaign was nearly flawless, but she lost.
Again, presidential campaigns are massive operations, and as you said, she had 100 days or something. But given that, she also had lots and lots of money, and I just think that American voters are so ill-informed. Most people don't know who the vice president is. So she had 100 days to introduce herself to many of the American people. There's that. Again, the global trends were against her. The things I mentioned earlier, the ways in which corporate media fails to contextualize what's happening with the economy, the ways in which Donald Trump continued to be normalized in the 4 years he was out of office. By the time we got to 2024, January 6th wasn't a big deal anymore, which is completely insane, by the way. That's crazy. That's objectively crazy that was allowed to happen. Plus, I mean, I'd like to think better of most people in America, but a black woman, we just have not dealt with our awful history enough, I think, to get enough people over that hurdle, which is a shame. I mean, something of which we should be ashamed. So there's that. And I think she made the mistake a lot of people make. I mean, I don't see it the way you described to the same degree. I don't think that Democrats actually really did focus too much on the so-called culture war issues. The Republicans did, though. The Republicans presented her as only talking about the rights of trans people, for example. And one of the most effective, if vile, campaign messages that Donald's campaign used was, I don't remember it exactly, but it was actually, in an awful kind of dystopian way, very effective. I'm for you, she's for they, or something like that.
That was a very powerful piece of political campaigning that really touched something in voters which they believed.
Yeah, and it was a hideous exploitation of the most vulnerable population in the country, and it was also untrue because the Democrats are always better for working class people. They're always better for the middle class, and yet that message wasn't getting out either. And I think there was a focus. If the Harris campaign focused on one thing too much, and I think Biden did this as well, it was the argument about democracy. That just doesn't resonate with enough people because I think Republicans will also say that they care about democracy. I just don't think we have the same definitions of what it means. So to deal with something at such a conceptual level, that doesn't help people in their day-to-day. And again, if you're in the incumbent administration and people are still struggling, they're not going to say, oh, well, this is the reverberation from decisions that were made under the first Trump administration. They're going to see the guy who's not in office attacking the people who are in office and blaming them for everything and also lying to you. Because remember, on day one, the Ukrainian war was supposed to be ended and prices were supposed to go down and inflation was supposed to go down. So it felt that he had much more freedom to say whatever he wanted that sounded good, while the Biden-Harris administration was trying to do the work, but also being held responsible for the fact that things weren't as good as people wanted them to be.
Final question, Mary. It's been a fascinating conversation. I just do appreciate you giving us so much time and so much of your thoughts. Listening to you and the debate in America, almost your familial relationship with Donald Trump is almost a metaphor for American politics, that there seems to be no joining point between the MAGA fans on one side and the Democrats or the people who are against that whole program on the other. The Trump family, your uncle, you are a metaphor for America because you cannot see anything in what the other side is offering or why they may be popular. Is that a fair analysis of the problem of America? There's no bridge.
Yes. It's a little more complicated, but to your point of, can I see anything good? No, nothing, literally nothing. And I think that is our biggest point of division, because, I do believe that if Republicans aren't explicitly fascists, they are fascistic and they are doing great harm to my country, and you cannot make common cause with these people.
Can the Democrats win again?
Yeah.
How?
They need a leader who can speak the truth unabashedly, pulling no punches, and use language that resonates with the American people. Democrats, they're right on the issues, but instead of speaking plainly about the dangers we're facing, about why things are worse now than they were and how we can make them better, they publish a 30-page white paper that nobody's ever going to read. It's not a good way to communicate. It's not efficient. It's not effective. And this is the thing. I think you alluded to this earlier, and it is one of the most important things that Democrats need to start understanding. One of the reasons people in the Republican base continue to support Donald Trump is because even though they're completely wrong about this, they think he's fighting for them because he's loud and he is belligerent and he acts like a tough guy. Now, none of that's true. I mean, he's belligerent, but he's not a tough guy, and he doesn't care about them. He does not care about their self-interests, and we can see this in what's happening with the economy. Inflation's going up, prices are going up, the social safety net is being completely frayed and endangered, right? But they still think that he's fighting for them because he just says that, and he says it loudly, and he says it repeatedly. The Democrats keep supporting Donald's nominees for certain cabinet positions or ambassadorships. They do not have a united opposition. They don't have a leader right now. And it is just unbelievable that they fail continually to understand this moment, so therefore they can't meet this moment. And if you can't find a way in the middle of this crisis we're living through to communicate to the American people how bad things are and how clear the Democrats are about what the solution is out of this mess, I don't know what to tell them. It's just like, what else do you need? It's like it's being handed to them on a silver platter, and that's another failure of the Harris campaign. They didn't go after Donald. Like, where were all of the ads about how bad things were when we had COVID? The insurrection, the big lie, none of that. It was like business as usual. This is just a normal campaign. There's nothing normal about the times in which we're living. I believe this. Everything is at stake in America and in the world because we have a leader who understands nothing and cares even less.
Mary Trump, thank you so much for visiting us here in the UK, for coming to the Daily Tea studio, and do enjoy your trip to this little old country.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.